nerds, what's up? So we recently showed our son The Fellowship of the Rings for the first time, and obviously that is an excellent movie and I have seen it a million times, but I realized while watching it I had not seen it since watching season 1 of The Rings of Power. And at one point during the movie, my husband and I both turned to each other and we realized we had both been thinking about Rings of Power while watching the movie. Mostly because we realized, once again, not that we didn't know this, but that Lord of the Rings has very specific imagery over good and evil. It's pretty black and white. You have the imageries of Sauron and the Ring and orcs, contrasted with heroes like Gandalf and Sam and Frodo. It almost has this like fairy tale-like quality to what it is trying to do. And the thought we both had was that, well, the Rings of Power tried to make Sauron more gray, explore his individuality. Now, I know there were other problems, in my opinion, with the Rings of Power Season 1 that I have detailed in other videos, but I did have the thought, was the fact that the Rings of Power was created in the 2020s a detriment overall to its success? As we've discussed before on this channel, right now, gray villains and gray characters are kind of on a forefront in a trend, and I wonder if the desire to follow that trend may end up fitting square pegs into round holes when it comes to adaptations. Now, we know with adaptations, and well, just like TV and movies in general, there are always trends. We saw a big vampire trend, we saw a YA dystopian trend, and right now we're seeing gray character trends. It's not that these characters and ideas don't exist outside of those trends, but during that time period, we tend to see kind of an influx of the same sort of types of things capitalizing on what's popular. And is that going to hurt an adaptation if it's made during a time when its original source material doesn't necessarily match the trend? Now, this video is not going to be talking about Rings of Power specifically. I've already said my piece on it, but it was the jumping off point for me to ask a specific question, which is, are there book adaptations that suffered because of the specific time period they were created in? I'm specifically interested in trying to answer this question about adaptations that were made at least a decade after the book was written, and preferably more, so that the differences in popularity or cultures or ideals at the time are more evident. So today, as with many of my videos, I wanted to do an open discussion about this topic, not necessarily to come to a firm conclusion, but to explore a lot of different examples and see if we can kind of ferret out any sort of answer or conclusion. So the things I specifically want to talk about today are things like reception at the time of creation versus longevity, what the goals of the adaptations were, positive and negative examples of where a time period might have influenced an adaptation, and things specific to fantasy adaptations in general that might make them different from other types of adaptations. And as always, I like to state the reminder that I was born and raised in the United States, so often my opinions about trends and influences and media are going to be Western focused because that is what I'm familiar with, so always something I want to throw out there. With that said, I'll see you after the jump. The first thing I wanted to address before we really jump into examples is that I did an open call on Instagram about this topic just to see if there were any adaptations I had missed thinking about. And one thing I noticed is that the vast majority of people were really stuck on the aesthetics of adaptations. They wanted to talk about like costuming and hairstyle. And I'm just really uninterested in that aspect of the adaptations. And this is for a couple of reasons I want to go over real quick. Look, I am not a costume or fashion expert in any sense, in any way. But I have watched a few videos from a large fashion creator called Modern Girls recently. About a year or so ago, I got recommended one of her videos detailing famous red or influential red dresses through cinema history. And I just saw Queen Amidala and clicked, because if you know anything about me, I am obsessed with the fashion in the prequels of Star Wars. I think it's iconic, and so I watched it and have since watched almost this entire series of her channel. I actually highly recommend it. It's super interesting, even if like me, you know nothing about fashion or costuming. But one thing I did learn about fashion, movie fashion, through these videos is that no matter how hard costumers try to be accurate to a time period a movie is set in, modern influences always seem to creep in. Now, this may be purposeful, One thing, even though I'm not a fashion expert at all, I do tend to notice is that often women's hairstyles are very anachronistic. They give women soft, long waves instead of hairstyles that were true to the time period, because I think they'd be seen as maybe uglier to today's viewers. But even if they do very time period accurate pieces in clothing, that modern trends still seep in. The decade it was made in still kind of influences what they're doing, often to either signal to modern viewers what kind of character they are through fashion, or just, yes, to make it more appealing to modern sensibilities. That is all to say, it happens a lot. It's gonna happen in almost any movie, and I'm just uninterested in exploring that. My interest today is to focus specifically on thematic differences on adaptations, not aesthetics. Now, I hope you don't mind if we start talking about movie adaptations that are not in the fantasy realm. The first adaptations that I thought of when thinking about this topic were classic novels for a couple of reasons. One, classics are generally written a long time ago, which means that there was a lot of distance between when they were written and their adaptations. Additionally, a lot of classic novels have multiple different adaptations, which are going to help us kind of peel out if a decade had effects on how it was adapted thematically. And so I immediately thought of Jane Austen adaptations because I'm a big Jane Austen fan and I grew up watching many of them. And the one I immediately thought of was Pride and Prejudice, which is my personal favorite. Now, Pride and Prejudice has been adapted a million times. I think there's something like 18 different Pride and Prejudice adaptations, and those vary from like specifically book accurate to adaptations with zombies. So lots of different ideas and purposes through them. But when I say a Pride and Prejudice adaptation to the general fan, you most likely think of two very specific ones, which is the 90s BBC 6-episode miniseries or 2005's Keira Knightley's. This is a great, solid example of what I'm looking for because the book was written in 1813 and these adaptations came a decade apart and are decently different. They also share something else critical. As adaptations, they are both extremely beloved. Although everyone has a favorite, I'm personally a diehard fan of the BBC's. In general, among fans, I find both to be well regarded. Although I prefer one, I recognize the greatness of the other as well. The BBC miniseries definitely shares aspects with other Austen adaptations of the 90s, in that it opts to remain incredibly close to the source material and also has a sort of simplicity about it, a lack of cinematic drama, so to speak. Whereas the 2005 version leans more heavily into the romance of the story, something I noticed immediately even when seeing it in the theater as a teen. In this way, it does feel more influenced by the early 2000s. Many of the romance scenes seem more comfortable in a 2000 setting than in an 1810 setting, yet I think this is why people love it. It modernized the romance in just small enough ways to make it more relatable to a modern audience, and it also highly ups the cinematic drama, in my opinion. These small theming changes work, in my opinion, because they still keep the very core aspects of the story. They have all the same events. They keep the same themes of class and freedom, and yes, of course, pride and prejudice. In this case, I think the modern elements are really injected in there to actually give modern audiences more of an understanding of the themes, more of a connection to what was going on in the story, rather than trying to detract or change them, which is why I think it works so well. There's two more examples I briefly want to talk about, which unsurprisingly have adaptations in the 90s. I am a 90s kid. I watched a lot of movies in the 90s, so it's where a lot of my media is rooted. But I did want to talk about another Jane Austen, which is Emma, specifically the movie that came out in 1996 to compare it to the one that came out in 2020, and then Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, the 1994 version and the 2019 version. Again, I find the 90s versions of these movies to be classified by understated cinema, kind of a rom-com-esque feel to the movies. With Emma, the 2020 version felt sharper than both its 90s predecessor and the book, slightly meaner wit, with again a focus on intimate romantic moments. For Little Women, the 2019 version was probably one of the most different of all these versions I've talked about. It rearranged the story to be flashbacks and flash forwards and changed the ending of the book entirely in a meta commentary from things known about the author and the history of the book. Again, both changes for these 2019 and 2020 movies injected a modernism found specifically in the 2020s, in my opinion. It should be noted, another reason I think these examples are really good is that they were mostly similarly received and well received. Now, I know Rotten Tomato scores aren't perfect, but they are kind of a general guide to kind of see how movies are generally received. I wanted to point out these scores because I realize the intention of my original question may have felt very negative, but that's not always the case. I think it can be a neutral question. Being influenced by the current time period doesn't automatically mean bad, or just it will only be enjoyable for a limited time in the time period it was created. So all of these movies I talked about have similar receptions. What about the longevity of these movies? Will the ones with more modern injection continue to have the same longevity? Now, it's a little too early to say, I think, for the Little Women and Emma adaptations, where were made pretty recently. But as far as Pride and Prejudice, I'm not saying 2005 was forever ago, but it was 20 years ago. And considering that the Keira Knightley version and the BBC version are both still super well regarded, it shows to me that injecting parts of modernism or being a little influenced by your time period again, isn't always a negative thing on the longevity or of a movie. I think the newer versions of Emma and Little Women will probably hold up pretty well, both for cinematography and mostly theming. I think if any of the movies is going to age poorly, it would be Little Women. And to be clear, I really enjoyed the 2019 Little Women. I thought it was a very good movie, but because of the changes to the ending specifically, I think there could be a switch in how people feel about that decision in the future, and I personally know a lot more people in my life who were very conflicted about the 2019 Little Women. The last Jane Austen I wanted to talk about was the newest Persuasion that came out. Now, admittedly, of all of these that I talked about, this is the only movie on the list I have not personally seen many times, so I can't speak for it personally. But the newest Persuasion, if you didn't know, I think was a Netflix adaptation, and it was received a lot more controversially. I think some people really liked it. I think some people really didn't like it. You can see the Rotten Tomato scores are definitely different than we saw on the other movies. And this one, of all the other adaptations I talked about, was the most rooted in the 2020s. In my opinion, extremely influenced by Fleabag. There was a fourth wall breaking element to Persuasion, and it seemed to be much more modern. But unlike some of our other modern adaptations, like Clueless, for example, of an adaptation of Emma, it also didn't put us fully into modern times. It still tried to keep the original atmosphere of Persuasion while injecting these extremely modern fourth wall breaking to limited success. Some people liked it, some people didn't. However, if I had to make a prediction, again, I haven't seen it, so I'm not going to make commentary on whether it was terrible or not. This is probably going to age the least well. Unlike Fleabag, which was a very original thing rooted in modern times, not an adaptation of anything, Persuasion was trying to capitalize on a trend as an adaptation. And because it already had limited success in the time period it was made in, I think it will probably have the least amount of longevity in the future and could be an example of a trend negatively influencing an adaptation. Now, as we move into our fantasy examples, I did want to briefly talk about how fantasy adaptations feel somehow different from the adaptations I just talked about. I do tend to notice a more visceral reaction to bad fantasy adaptations than like a bad Jane Austen adaptation. When a bad Jane Austen adaptation comes out, most of my friends are like, well, that kind of sucked. Oh well. When a bad fantasy adaptation comes out, the whole fandom kind of explodes. Now, this may just be because I'm closer to fantasy fandoms, but I actually think there are a couple other reasons. My opinion is I think fantasy adaptations feel higher stakes. If there's a bad Pride and Prejudice adaptation, I know I'm probably going to get at least 10 more before I die. With a fantasy adaptation, it often feels like we only get one chance. And there's two reasons I think for this. One, fantasy adaptations in general tend to be way higher budgeted. They have way more monetary needs just through CGI and scope in general. And two, there is this perception that fantasy is more niche. It is not as accessible to the everyday audience. Now, do I personally agree with that? No. I've talked in many different videos about how that's not really true. But that's the perception, and so I think they just tend to get made less. Fantasy feels riskier. And then number 3, in the grand scheme of the literary world, fantasy is a young genre. Now again, I have a whole video about the history of fantasy. Fantasy has been written since things were being written. But as a classification, as a genre, it's pretty new. Most people consider like the official fantasy genre really be created with The Lord of the Rings, which was less than a century ago. So we tend to not have as many classics, things that are widely accepted as universal stories. If I go into sci-fi, we have Dune, we have Lord of the Rings, but otherwise, I think to the general population, these things feel newer. And maybe it's because of those 3 things, but I notice we don't have as many repeat adaptations to choose from. I just said these Jane Austen novels have like 10 to 20 adaptations. With a fantasy novel, we often only get 1. Even our most famous stories, like I mentioned previously, Lord of the Rings and Dune, which I realize is sci-fi, but I'm blending them for the moment. With Lord of the Rings, we only had 3 adaptations-ish. 2 were animated, so I feel like they really fall under their own category, and then The Lord of the Rings. With Dune, we also have 3. We have our 1984 movie, we have a miniseries, and then we have our 2020 adaptations, which I'm combining those 2 movies since they do 1 book. In fact, the only fantasy thing I could think of that had a million adaptations would be Spider-Man, which we've gotten a lot of iterations of in a very short amount of time. But often people classify superheroes differently because they started in the comic book sphere, and I think have permeated the general population a lot more, so I think sometimes people put them in their own category. So that was a bit of an aside. I just wanted to talk about that because I'm always interested in talking about why fantasy fans may feel so passionate and high stakes about their adaptations. As I talked about in my Toxic Fan video, I think our communities are often misunderstood. And while I'm the last person on earth to claim that bad behavior is okay and that harassing actors or filmmakers is somehow good behavior, absolutely not. I just have a lot of empathy for the feelings that fans have about these sort of things when we've often waited so long and we want everyone to love the stories we love as much as we do. Did we just get a little off topic? Maybe. Let's circle back to fantasy adaptations. We already discussed Rings of Powers a bit and how perhaps our current trends weren't a great fit for a Lord of the Rings adaptation, even if it was a spin-off. I want to talk about Dune. Now, I haven't seen the miniseries, so I'm specifically going to be talking about the 1984 Dune and then our newer 2020 version of Dune. This one's an interesting one to talk about because I personally do see thematic focus differences between the 1984 version and the 2020 version. The biggest one I see is that in the newer version, there's a greater emphasis on the colonialism and religious fanaticism aspects of Dune. And I think that's pretty in line with current feelings and media trends to explore those themes more deeply. Ironically, in this case, I actually think that makes it more in line with the original Dune novel. Full disclosure, I have only read the first Dune, and it was almost 10 years ago now. I have not read the other Dune novels, but I do know in those novels it explores more deeply Paul as a chosen one and definitely subverts that trope. If anything, I think this is almost a perfect time to make another Dune adaptation, where trends and the original source material are really aligning. Of course, it is always a little hard to compare adaptations like this. 30 plus years of special effects development made the newest Dune movies a visual spectacle of incredible proportions, and no matter how hard the 1980s movies tried, it wasn't going to be a visual feast like these 4 hours are, and it's just hard to try and disregard that when you talk about successive adaptations. We're only human. I can talk about focusing only on the themes as much as I want, but yes, my brain is still going to focus on how beautiful those movies were to watch. Let's talk Wheel of Time. Would the Wheel of Time adaptation been closer aligned with the books if the adaptations were made in the 90s? Now, obviously I know all the Wheel of Time books were not finished in the 90s, but let's talk about a late 90s adaptation when 6 or 7 of the books were out, and a series doesn't need to be done for an adaptation to start on the earlier books. My answer is yes. I do think a 90s adaptation of The Wheel of Time would have been different than the one we currently got, but I think it's for different reasons than people would expect. When we're talking about the 2020s specifically affecting the adaptation, I think 2 elements probably affected it, which was the way that content is coming out today and B, the Game of Thrones of it all. It's important to remind you guys here that I've been in the Wheel of Time fandom for a bit, like back when we were on message boards and not Reddit. And contrary to what you might think, we as fans knew its flaws. We knew some of the aspects that were kind of rooted in 90s fantasy. And as hard as it is to believe, when the adaptation was first announced, I would say a majority of fans kind of understood that there were going to be some things that were going to be changed, and we weren't like upset about it. There was just some, in general things. However, I get the sense, again, no proof, but I get the sense that what the writers ended up being worried about was the generic fantasy of it. I felt like they wanted to make it different, not the story it was. Now, ironically, I think a lot of their changes actually made the story more generic than it actually is. But in my opinion, you sort of felt the worry over Rand as a character. You felt their concern that Rand wasn't interesting enough to be the lead of the story. And I also feel like they tried to make it more adult and aged up the characters, which I've talked in many videos I definitely think is a Game of Thrones effect. A Game of Thrones was so wildly successful as a TV show, I think people are still looking to it to understand the success of it and try to emulate it. And so yes, if Wheel of Time was adapted in the 90s, I don't think those two elements would be hanging so heavy over the story. The A Song of Ice and Fire of it wouldn't have been there, and just the amount of content being created wasn't there yet. Now, obviously the changing of themes and timing weren't the only things going on with that production, and I've talked about a lot various things I thought went wrong with it. I just think those are two elements that are interesting to discuss in the broader scope of it. I want to briefly talk about Harry Potter because that was one of the ones that was most talked about in my Instagram stories. I think this one's a fascinating one to talk about simply because I don't think it's a good example at all, because the books and the movies were pretty much coming out at the same time. They were being written and these movies were being produced pretty much in the same decade. So personally, I think any thematic things there would be in the books and in the movies together. There's not enough distance. Now, if they do eventually end up making the TV show that they've been talking about, then I think it would be interesting to see how that was different than the books and the movies. But I think they were made too close together to be different enough for this discussion. There's one last example I want to talk about, which unfortunately does break the rules I set forward, but this is my video, so I can do what I want. And that is I want to talk about Andor, which is not a book adaptation. It is technically a movie adaptation because our source material for Star Wars is the original movies episodes 1 through 6. Or episodes 4 through 3. Is that how we're gonna say it? But I'm considering the original book to be the episodes written by George Lucas, and everything else, show or movie that's come out, to be an adaptation of that, just for the purposes of this discussion. I want to bring up Andor because it does bring up another side of this issue, because I think you could say Andor is also very influenced by the time period it was created in. Can I really say that Star Wars isn't a black and white exploration of good and evil? We have the dark and light sides of the Force. It has a lot of those classic elements. Whereas Andor is definitely a grayer look into the Star Wars universe with complicated and morally gray characters and villains, and kind of more like nitty-gritty, realistic look into the rebellion. So how come I'm all sitting here like, Rings of Power is too influenced by the morally gray trend, and then in the same breath being like, Andor's the best Star Wars that's been created since the original 6 movies? It's a little hypocritical of me, isn't it? Now, admittedly, I can try to wave this away by saying a large theme in the original Star Wars was redemption, and it's clear that Andor has a lot of redemption undertones. So in that way, I can say, hey, thematically, we stayed the same. But I actually think there's another element here that's important, in that Andor did not try to use almost any characters from our original stories. We have a couple, but it's very, very light. Pretty much everybody is new, meaning all of the characters we are turning morally gray are not characters that existed or we knew of really in our kind of more light versus dark side of the Force. You'll notice Rings of Power has the opposite problem. Pretty much every character is a known entity in Rings of Power. Sauron is the main villain in The Lord of the Rings, and he exists there in a certain way. So I think Rings of Power can feel like a rewriting of history, a rewriting of themes in a way that Andor doesn't necessarily. And so I think when we talk about this broader topic of adaptations, and if we kind of go into the spin-off of it all, I think a big benefit of not having this hanging over a production's head of changing themes too much is to create new characters so they can exist in slightly different spaces. I do sort of wonder if Rings of Power, since it doesn't have the rights to much anyway, just explore completely new characters in Tolkien's world, how the reception might have been a little different. That's just a theory, kind of just food for thought. Okay, this video sort of got away from me, and I recognize that, but I think it's a really interesting discussion and just something I don't really think has an answer because I think there are so many elements that make a good and bad adaptation. And one thing I thought about is something I've said before, is that there's also just some stories and some themes that are just more relevant through time than other themes. Even when we're not talking about adaptations, you can see movies from the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, 50s, 60s that are very rooted in the political movements or the political worries of the time. And then there are some writers and stories that kind of transcend that and get to themes that are kind of always relevant. I've always talked about how Terry Pratchett and Octavia Butler are two examples of authors that I think are just excellent at getting to themes that always feel relevant no matter what. And so of course that's also going to influence a story and an adaptation. If your adaptation focuses more on themes or worries of a current time period, there's no guarantee that those are necessarily overarching ones. Anyway, this is just always a topic I'm super fascinated in, and I hope it was somewhat interesting for you. I would love to hear your opinion on this. Do you feel like thematically recently you have noticed things that are current worries of like society right now that are subtly changing adaptations of books? Or do you think that's not true and the other elements are more important for success or failure? Anything you want to talk about, let me know in the comments below. And if you like these kind of deep dives and explorations, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, as well as other nerdy rants or participate in polls, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.